Hello and welcome to our lecture on commerce power, in which we will consider the direct and indirect effects doctrine of the Supreme Court. Okay, just by way of review, we said that federalism and commerce are very closely related. They are both questions of limits on federal power, and that federalism is about tensions between the state and the federal government when they conflict over who should have power to regulate something or implement some policy. But the commerce power is simply about limits on federal power and whether the federal government is using its power appropriately to regulate individual transaction or whether it's encroaching on the state power to do so. In the last lecture we considered the case Gibbons versus Ogden, in which Chief Justice Marshall made the decision and ruled that the federal government could supersede the laws of the state of New York when it was licensing Gibbons to operate steamships in between two states, in this case New York and New Jersey. So what happens after Gibbons? Well, remember that we said that that Marshall establishes a threshold question for us. Is it interstate commerce? If it is, then Congress can regulate, and it can regulate as much or as little as it pleases. This rule has never changed. It is the rule with respect to commerce, and you should understand that. The threshold question is always, is it interstate commerce? If it is interstate commerce, Congress can regulate it as much as it likes. If it's not, Congress may not regulate it. So let me ask you, if you were a justice in the mid-19th and early 20th centuries and you didn't like this rule, how would you get around it? I mean, you can't overturn it, right? It's Chief Justice Marshall. You don't change your socks in the middle of the World Series, right? You can't overturn this. It's precedent. So how do you get around it? Well, the answer is you just start saying that things are not commerce. That's the way to do it. You don't say, well, it's commerce, but we don't like Congress regulating it. You just simply say, no, this is commerce and this is not. And that's what happens. For example, manufacturing. Now, we know that navigation is not commerce, but it is so intermingled with commerce that Congress can regulate it. But manufacturing, the courts in the mid-19th and early 20th century said, no, manufacturing is local in character. It precedes actual commerce. You can't have commerce without manufacturing, but manufacturing is not commerce. It precedes commerce, thus it is not commerce, and Congress cannot usually regulate it. So the court went about distinguishing commerce from manufacturing. In a case called Vesey versus Moore in 1853, the court ruled that the idea that commerce includes manufacturing as a concept is pretentious. It ruled it out altogether. Well, makes sense, you know. Just a few years after Gibbons versus Ogden, the court says, nope, manufacturing is not commerce. In another case, Kidd versus Pearson, the court defines the distinction. It says that manufacturing is not buying and selling, it's transformation of raw goods into some saleable thing. Sometimes, right? Manufacturing could involve the extraction of raw materials and their sale as something that is then even later transformed. And that would make manufacturing even farther back from commerce. So let's say you run a steel mill, and you manufacture these large pieces of steel that are then shipped to another company that will use machines to carve them down, to carve them into, I don't know, let's say surgical instruments like Worthington Industries in Columbus, Ohio. Worthington Industries doesn't manufacture steel. It gets high-grade steel from someone who has manufactured it, extracted it already. So Kidd versus Pearson makes that distinction. Now, a very important case that you should read very closely is United States versus E.C. Knight Company, occurring in 1895. In this case, a company acquired E.C. Knight Company. Now, E.C. Knight Company refined sugar. It wasn't selling sugar to consumers, it was refining sugar. This other company, the American Sugar Refining Company, acquired EC Knight Company and several other companies and basically cornered the market on the manufacture, the refinement of sugar. After it acquired EC Knight, it owned 95% of the refining capabilities in the United States. The United States government didn't allow the sale to go through because it said that this was a restraint of trade under the Sherman Antitrust Act, and it was a restraint of trade, not a restraint of manufacturing. And EC Knight sued because it wanted to be sold, and it said manufacturing is not commerce, so there's no trading going on to restrain. So the court asked the question, does Congress have the power to regulate the manufacture of goods under its power to regulate interstate commerce? It answered that question by saying no in an 8-to-1 vote, majority written by Justice Fuller. He argues that while the federal government says that refined sugar is a staple of life and should therefore be regulated, the court cannot agree. It is manufacturing of sugar. It is not interstate commerce. It is manufacturing, and manufacturing precedes commerce altogether. So is manufacturing commerce? Very good question. The key distinction here is the direct versus indirect effects doctrine, which is the subject of our lecture. What is this doctrine? A direct effect would be distribution, navigation, and transportation, right? Navigation and transportation aren't commerce. We know this from Gibbons versus Ogden, but they are so bound up in it, they so directly affect commerce that Congress can regulate it. An indirect effect would be manufacturing. Sure, you can't have something to sell unless you've manufactured it, but manufacturing is not so closely related to an endpoint transaction that Congress can get to it. It is an indirect effect. This initially meant that Congress couldn't regulate. It couldn't regulate manufacturing. So who would regulate manufacturing? The court said that manufacturing was wholly local in character. It occurred within states. And who does the Constitution say can regulate economic activity that occurs wholly within a state? The states, not the federal government. All right, so after EC Knight, and by the way, the sale was allowed to go through because Congress could not stop it under the Sherman Antitrust Act. But after EC Knight, you should know certain things that happened historically. President McKinley says the Sherman Antitrust Act is dead. Well, that wasn't exactly true, because very short time later, President McKinley was dead, and President Roosevelt was very much in favor of the Sherman Antitrust Act, and he began to go after monopolies. But he was restricted by EC Knight. He couldn't go after monopolies in manufacturing, but he could go after monopolies in endpoint interstate commercial transactions. So this is what it says here on the screen. However, because the feds had so little power, it was possible that EC Knight helped fuel the Great Depression. In other words, the federal government could not create a national policy with respect to the price of extracted raw materials. And thus, these companies, like the American Sugar Refining Company, could set virtually any price they wanted on the refined sugar that they manufactured. This jacked up prices or lowered them when companies that had a monopoly wanted to drive other companies out of the market. All right, so in summary then, the direct and indirect effects doctrine is a distinction between actual commerce and or things directly a part of actual commerce on one hand, and things that precede commerce and only indirectly relate to actual transacting. So here's a list of some things. Buying and selling, absolutely, that's commerce. As long as it's occurring interstate, Congress can regulate. Transportation and navigation, it's not commerce, but it's directly related. Thus, Congress can regulate. That's Gibbons v. Ogden. Manufacturing or extraction of raw materials, it is not commerce. It is only indirectly related, and it is local in character. Thus, states can regulate using their police powers for the public good. And labor, this is a big one. Labor is part of manufacturing, largely. It's not buying and selling. It's part of manufacturing, particularly labor in the production of manufactured goods, for example, creating steel, extracting steel, refining sugar, other sorts of things. Labor is not interstate commerce. So who can regulate labor? Not Congress. Under the direct and indirect effects doctrine, only states can regulate labor, the labor market, because it is local in character. By the way, a heads up, that issue right there, states regulating labor, that's the subject of week 7. Thank you very much for listening, and we will move along.